What gives a stranger so much power over someone's memory that a simple afternoon becomes impossible to forget? I've asked myself that question so many times, I've lost count. And before I go on, I want you to write in the comments where you're listening from. City, state, country. Because even though I'm about to tell you something that happened to me, the truth is that this story belongs to so many women from so many different places that you might see yourself in every word you're about to hear. I've always believed that some encounters are like doors that open without warning. You walk through without thinking, without imagining what waits on the other side, and before you realize it, you're already caught in a story you never asked to be part of. That's exactly how it happened that day. It wasn't a special day, nor a day I was looking forward to. It was just an ordinary day, the kind we live through without imagining it will stay with us forever. I wasn't searching for anything grand. Not change, not revelation, not answers. I was just living my life, the way I always have, with the steady calm of someone who's weathered too many storms and learned how to keep walking even when the winds grow harsh. I never imagined that on such a simple day my path would cross with someone who carried enough wealth to buy anything he wanted, except the things that truly matter. He didn't enter my life like a thunderbolt. Nothing dramatic, nothing loud. It was quiet, subtle, as if the universe were laying out the scene step by step so I could understand that even small coincidences carry a bigger purpose. I should have noticed it in that very first glance. There was something in the way he looked around, as if every person in the room were nothing more than an object placed there for his convenience, as if the world existed to serve him. It was the kind of gaze that doesn't see a face, doesn't see history, doesn't see a soul, only status, appearance, usefulness. But in that moment, I didn't let it affect me. You learn to ignore certain behaviors when you've lived long enough, when you've faced more than just words, when you've understood that oversized pride usually hides something even bigger behind it. I simply noticed and moved on. After all, what could possibly come from such a casual encounter? What could be special about a man who seemed more fascinated by his own reflection than anything happening around him? Even so, there was a weight in the air, a feeling that something was about to happen, even if I couldn't name it. A subtle hint, almost invisible, like the wind shifting right before the rain. And no matter how much I tried to ignore that feeling, it stayed with me. I walked. I did what I needed to do, but that small uneasiness clung to me, like a shadow too discreet to frighten, yet too present to overlook. That's when I heard him speak for the first time. His voice was firm, steady, trained to be noticed. The voice of someone used to being obeyed, attended to, admired. He spoke with ease, with that polished arrogance that only someone with too much power and far too little empathy tends to carry. Every word felt chosen to remind the people around him of his place in the world. A high place, a bright place, a distant place, a place where he believed he was untouchable. That was the first moment my heart tightened, even without an obvious reason. A quiet, discreet squeeze, as if my body sensed something long before my mind understood it. It wasn't fear. It wasn't rejection. It was simply a warning. Pay attention. Something here is not ordinary. Something here requires caution. I took a deep breath and kept going. But destiny doesn't wait for anyone. It doesn't ask whether we're ready, whether we're willing, whether we want to step into the story. It simply sets things in motion, and by the time we notice, we're already inside a scene we never imagined living. When I finally stood face to face with him, I realized that feeling hadn't exaggerated anything. His presence dominated the space, not through elegance, but through sheer arrogance. He moved as if the ground itself had been designed to match his steps. He spoke as if every sentence were a command, and he looked at people as if he were constantly measuring, weighing, deciding who deserved attention and who deserved absolutely nothing. I wasn't there to impress anyone. I wasn't there to compete. I was there because life put me there, because the small, simple things we do every day end up placing us, without warning, in situations that change everything. He noticed me with one of those quick glances that still manage to mark you, the kind of look that catches something unexpected, the kind that tries to categorize what doesn't fit into familiar boxes. The silence between us lasted only a few seconds, but it felt much longer. He looked at me, as if he had the right to decide my worth. And right there, in that instant, I knew something was about to happen. Something that would affect me in a way I wasn't prepared for. Something I would never forget. If I had followed my instincts, maybe I would have turned away. Maybe I would have avoided that moment. Maybe I would have escaped the words that came next. But I didn't. I stayed. And by staying, I allowed that ordinary encounter to become the most bitter memory a stranger has ever given me. The way he opened his mouth, the way his eyes tightened, the way the air around us seemed to shift. For a split second, all of it was a clear sign, a warning, a door opening into something I would only understand much later. I had no idea what was coming. I didn't imagine that a few words could carry enough weight to pierce a soul. I didn't imagine that someone so wealthy could be so hollow on the inside. I didn't imagine that a simple encounter could leave a mark so deep that years later it would still echo within me. And it was right there, in that suspended moment between who I was before and who I would be after, that he decided to speak to me. Not a greeting, not a question, nothing human, gentle, or respectful. None of that. What came out of his mouth in that moment was something no amount of money could ever justify. But I'm not going to tell you what he said just yet. Before you hear every word, you need to understand the scene, the energy, the weight, and the silence that existed before the phrase that changed everything. Because only by understanding what came before will you feel, as I did, the impact of what was about to happen. And this is where this part of the story ends, but it's also where the real tension begins. Because what he said, that deserves to be heard at the right moment, when he finally turned fully toward me, as if only then realizing I existed. I felt something shift in the room. It wasn't the noise, it wasn't the light, it wasn't the movement around us. It was the energy, the kind of energy that shows up when someone used to being treated like royalty decides to look at someone they consider beneath them. It was almost as if the air grew heavier, denser, filled with a pride that no longer fit inside that man. He looked at me without actually seeing me, and I knew it because his gaze slid across my face the way someone looks through a store window, searching for something more interesting on the other side. There was no humanity there, no curiosity, no respect, only assessment, coldness, a polished form of disdain wrapped beneath, a thin layer of purchased elegance. And the most curious thing was that even before he said a single word to me, you could already feel that he had formed an opinion about who I was, an opinion based on nothing more than what his eyes saw on the outside. A black woman, older, simple, walking calmly, with no need to impress anyone. The kind of presence that goes unnoticed by people who grew up believing the world exists to serve them. The way he lifted his chin, subtle but full of meaning, made it clear that, in his mind, I wasn't someone. I was something, a distraction, an inconvenience, a piece out of place in the luxurious scenery he was used to moving through. He carried himself with the habit of being tended to before he even asked, as if he'd spent his whole life on a pedestal, surrounded by people who bent themselves, adjusted themselves, shrank themselves, so he wouldn't have to move a single inch more than necessary. He was the kind of man who, even in silence, made the entire room work for him. And the more I observed, the clearer it became that his sense of wealth wasn't just in his money, but in the treatment he received. The world had taught him that he had rights others didn't, that his voice mattered more, that his presence held more weight, that his desires came before anything else. And he believed that, with a conviction so deep it almost looked natural. But what caught my attention wasn't just the way he behaved, it was the way he reacted to my presence. It was as if I had stepped into a territory he believed belonged to him, as if I had crossed some invisible line between what he considered worthy and what he considered disposable. He didn't need to speak to show it. His eyes did. His posture did. That intentional distance he created, as if to make it clear we did not share the same world. And even though I had seen many looks like that throughout my life, this one was different, because there was something else behind it, something harder, sharper, more deliberate, something I would only fully understand later, when his words were finally spoken. While he spoke to the people nearby, in that cold way of his, with a chill that felt like a winter that never ends, I started to notice the enormous gap between the value he placed on himself and the value he gave others. He treated the people around him the same way someone looks at an expensive object, careful not to scratch it, but without any real feeling attached. And the longer I watched that silent scene, the more glaring the human poverty behind all that shine became. Because there is a kind of loneliness that disguises itself as power, an emotional poverty that disguises itself as greatness, a hollow emptiness so deep it needs constant applause just to seem like anything at all. He spoke beautiful words, polished, articulate, wrapped in status and formality, but there was no soul in them, no life, no truth. And no matter how elegant he seemed, no matter how expensive his clothes were, no matter how rehearsed his gestures looked, everything about him felt too superficial to hide what was really driving him. His need to be seen, his need to be admired, his need to be recognized as someone above, someone unreachable, someone untouchable, a need so desperate it was almost visible to the naked eye. I stood nearby, silently observing, taking in every detail, the way he spoke without looking anyone in the eye, the way he interrupted without noticing, the way he reacted with irritation to anything he couldn't control, the way the people around him seemed to choose their words carefully, as if afraid of provoking his anger or disappointing his expectations. The scene was so clear, so revealing, that I was surprised I hadn't noticed earlier that behind all that luxury was a deeply insecure man. A man so used to being served that he no longer recognized humanity when it stood right in front of him. And it's strange how life sometimes places exactly this kind of person in our path, not to humiliate us, but to make us see something we needed to learn, something about them, something about ourselves, something about the world, something about strength and human fragility. I could feel it there, even without knowing how to explain it, as if that encounter, uncomfortable as it was, had a purpose that hadn't shown itself yet, but was quietly waiting for the right moment. When he finally turned his attention toward me and took the first step, in my direction, the silence seemed to stretch, not because he was special, but because something inside me warned that this moment would matter. The arrogance he carried as he walked toward me wasn't just habit, it was conviction. Conviction that everything and everyone existed to serve him, to please him, to bend to his will. And at the same time, conviction that no one would ever challenge him, no one would ever question him, no one would ever make him face his own inner emptiness. I stood, firm, not out of bravery, but out of survival. Women like me learn early to hold our own ground when life keeps pushing us. I didn't step back, didn't look away, didn't shrink, and maybe that was what bothered him. Maybe that simple act, or the absence of fear, stirred something in him. Because people who are used to dominating don't know what to do with someone who doesn't bow. They don't know what to do with someone who isn't intimidated. They don't know what to do with someone who refuses to be made small. He stopped in front of me with that air of superiority pouring off of him. And even before he opened his mouth, I could feel that whatever was about to come wouldn't be kind, wouldn't be gentle, wouldn't be human. His words would be sharp, cutting, laced with judgment and contempt. Words meant to pierce not just the skin, but a woman's entire story. Words that had nothing to do with who I was, and everything to do with who he was. And when he finally began to speak, the world around us seemed to shrink until it was just me, him, and that heavy pride hanging in the air like a dark shadow. Every gesture carried intention. Every word held a hidden poison. Every pause felt rehearsed to make the next phrase hurt more. It was as if he were about to reveal not only what he thought of me, but what he thought of the world, and the way he chose to treat me in that moment was the first glimpse of his real essence. But before I go on with this story, before I reveal what was actually said, I need to ask you something important. If you're not subscribed to this channel yet, if you're not part of this space, you need to subscribe now. Not just so you don't miss the end of this story, which is already taking a turn you won't expect, but because this channel is a place where women like you find voice, strength, truth, healing, and stories many people hide, but we live. Here, you are not alone. Here, your pain is seen, your experiences matter, your story echoes. So if you're not subscribed yet, do it now, because you deserve to be in a place where your life experience matters, a place where truth is told without fear, a place where every video gives you something no one else gives, and you'll understand exactly why when you hear what comes next. When he opened his mouth to speak to me, there was no rush, no hesitation, no trace of humanity. He savored that moment, like someone who had finally found the perfect target for his venom. And it's strange how sometimes words that haven't even been spoken yet already start to hurt before they exist. That's exactly what I felt. A silent warning, a cold sensation running through my chest, like my body knew before my mind that something painful was about to be thrown at me. His eyes narrowed in a way I'll never forget. It wasn't anger. It wasn't frustration. It was a practiced kind of disdain, the kind only found in people who believe they are far too superior to share the same space with someone like me. The kind of disdain learned over years, repeated so many times it becomes a second skin. He leaned in slightly, as if to show he was about to say something final, something meant to cut, something so full of arrogance it should force anyone to look down. But I didn't. I stood my ground, even as I felt the floor almost give beneath me. When the first word left his mouth, time seemed to slow, not because of what he said, but because of the tone, that harsh, dry, cold tone that reveals more about the speaker than the listener. It was the voice of someone used to determining the fate of others with a sentence, the voice of someone who doesn't realize that certain phrases, when thrown at the wrong person, have the power to ruin an entire day or an entire life. He spoke as if he were doing me a favor, as if he were offering a truth he believed was justified. But all he did was reopen a wound I thought had long since healed. His words came loaded with judgment, not the light kind, but the kind that invades, that prods, that questions the very essence of who you are. He spoke as if he knew me, as if he had the right to define my story, my worth, my place. And slowly I began to realize that what hurt wasn't the phrase itself, but what lay behind it. His certainty that I deserved no more than that. His certainty that my existence could be reduced to a cruel comment. His certainty that he had that kind of power. As he spoke, I felt something inside me crack, not for the first time. Women like me know that sound. The sound of being diminished. The sound of being treated as invisible. The sound of being pushed into a corner you never chose. It's not loud. It's not explosive. It's like the quiet click of a door being closed slowly, leaving you on the outside without even realizing when you were placed there. I felt my chest tighten, not out of sadness, but out of a deeper pain that mixed past and present, as if his words had awakened old voices I'd tried to silence throughout my life. Voices that say women like me must be strong all the time. Voices that say we must endure humiliation quietly. Voices that say that, to some people, our existence will always be seen as an inconvenience, an obstacle, something lesser. Hearing him speak brought all those voices echoing back into my mind, but at the same time, something even deeper was happening. He kept talking, and I felt as if I were being pushed away from myself, as if for a few seconds I had stopped existing. Not because I believed any of his words, but because the violence in them was so unexpected, it knocked the ground out from under me. Humiliation has that kind of power. It doesn't need to be physical to bring you down. Sometimes a single sentence thrown at the right or the wrong moment is enough to set everything inside you on fire. His face didn't show guilt, didn't show doubt. He looked satisfied with every syllable he spoke, as if he were cleansing his own soul by staining mine. It was as if he wanted to see my reaction, as if he expected me to fall apart right there in front of him, to shrink, to lower my head, to bow to the greatness he believed he possessed. But I stood there, completely still, feeling only the growing weight of humiliation taking shape. I didn't react, I didn't respond, and for some reason that seemed to irritate him even more, because he sank even deeper into his own cruelty. He kept talking, and every word felt chosen to wound. There wasn't even an attempt to hide his intention. It was raw, direct, offensive, in a way so calculated it was almost elegant, in the worst way possible. And while he attacked me without knowing a single thing about my life, my pain, my struggles, my stories, I wondered where that need came from. What makes a man so rich, so powerful, so admired, feel the urge to hurt a woman who posed no threat at all? A woman who was simply there, existing? I began to realize that the humiliation in that moment said more about him than it did about me. Something inside that man was broken. So broken that he needed to tear others down just to feel whole. He spoke like someone trying to cover a hole in his own chest, layering it with harsh words as if that could fill the emptiness. And in a strange way, the way he hurt me made the emotional poverty within him painfully clear. Still, that didn't soften the impact of his words. They entered me like silent blades, cutting slowly without haste, finding every part of my story that hadn't fully healed. It felt like being erased from the inside, as if each phrase he threw stripped away a piece of my presence, my strength, my confidence. My eyes burned, not with tears, but with the effort to keep my dignity intact in that moment. Because sometimes the real battle isn't against the person who humiliates us, but against what humiliation tries to do to our soul. He finished speaking with a dismissive gesture, as if he had completed a mission, as if he had done what needed to be done. And as he walked away, still carrying that air of superiority that seemed to drip off him, I stayed still, trying to gather the pieces of what was left of me inside that heavy silence. The room around me hadn't changed, but everything inside me had shifted. I wasn't sure if I felt anger, sadness, indignation, or just that old kind of exhaustion. An exhaustion many women know well, when another wound opens on top of so many that were already there. There was a moment when I considered leaving, walking, away, pretending nothing had happened. But something held me still. Something inside me whispered that this moment wasn't just about me. It was about every woman who has ever been reduced to nothing by someone who believed they were everything. It was about every silent pain swallowed to avoid conflict, every humiliation hidden out of shame, every woman who has heard something similar and stayed quiet because she learned that's how the world works. I knew I couldn't reveal his exact words. Yet, not in that moment, not now. Because before revealing them, you need to understand the weight of the silence that came after. A silence that hovered thick, uncomfortable, almost suffocating. A silence that tries to take shape inside us when something so cruel is said that it doesn't fit into a quick reaction, an impulsive answer, or a simple escape. It was a silence that carried entire histories, a silence that spoke for me and for so many others. And as that silence wrapped around me, as I tried to breathe and keep my body steady, I realized something I hadn't yet understood. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning, because the impact of those words didn't end when he stopped talking. In truth, that's when the real effect began. It was in that heavy emptiness, in that quiet pain, in that tight knot in my throat that I would start to understand that none of what he said had anything to do with me. It had everything to do with him, with the misery he carried, with the shadows he tried to hide, with the poverty his money could never cure. And that was the exact moment I understood that no matter how much it hurt, no matter how deeply it marked me, no matter how hard it was to endure, that humiliation would not be the final chapter of my story. It would simply be another door opening. And behind that door, there was a much bigger truth waiting for me. When he walked away, leaving behind that trail of arrogance that seemed to cling to the air, I remained still. It felt like my body had been separated from my mind. One part of me wanted to move forward, breathe deeply, take control of my steps again, while the other part stayed stuck in that instant, like a photograph burned into the back of my soul. It wasn't just the pain of what he said. It was the silence that followed. A heavy silence, dense, almost solid. The kind of silence that doesn't leave room for thought, only feeling. And what I felt in that moment went deeper than any offensive word could explain. I walked slowly, as if the floor had moved farther from my feet. Each step seemed to drag something inside me, something old, buried, something I didn't even know was still there. It's incredible how humiliation has the power to echo memories we thought we'd outgrown. The pain of today speaks to wounds from the past, and those silent conversations can break us apart before we even realize it. And that day, as I left that place, I realized I wasn't carrying only the hurt he caused. I was carrying all the quiet hurts from my entire life. The walk home felt longer than usual. The wind brushed softly against me, but nothing eased the weight in my chest. I didn't have tears in my eyes. I wasn't someone who cried easily, but something burned inside me. something that couldn't find a way out. I tried to form thoughts, tried to convince myself that his words shouldn't have so much power over me, tried to remind myself that I had survived far worse. But the truth is this: no matter how strong we learn to be, certain words find their way into cracks we didn't know were still open. As I walked, I noticed my breathing had changed, shorter, tighter, like the air had to push through a wall before reaching my lungs. I asked myself, without speaking a word aloud, why it had hit me so hard, and the answer came in a silent, cruel way. Because it was familiar. Because I had been treated that way before. Not with the same words, but with the same disdain, the same shrinking, the same feeling of being reduced, the same attempt to push me into a small, narrow place where I couldn't exist fully. I remembered being young and hearing comments about my hair, my skin, my voice, as if everything about me were always open for judgment. I remembered the times I was ignored in places where I had just as much right to be as anyone else. I remembered moments when I was treated as if I were invisible, as if my story had no value. And I remembered especially the times when I myself began to believe in those quiet lies the world tries to plant inside us. And that's why his humiliation hurt so deeply. Not because the words were new, but because they touched an old wound. A wound I had carried in silence for years, convincing myself it had healed, convincing myself I had moved past it. But the truth is, some scars never stop hurting completely when pressed hard enough. And he pressed. He pressed with the coldness of someone who doesn't recognize the human being on the other side. He pressed with the cruelty of someone who never had to think about the weight of their own words. He pressed with the insensitivity of someone who never had to gather the pieces of themselves after being broken by the world. When I finally reached home, I closed the door and leaned my back against it, as if keeping the world out could protect me from the pain I carried inside. The house was silent, but it wasn't a peaceful silence. It was a silence that forced me to hear my own thoughts, my own insecurities, my own memories. I slowly took off my shoes, as if afraid that any sudden movement might break the fragile balance I was trying to hold together. I sat in the chair in the living room and stared at my hands. I've always believed a woman's hands tell the story of everything she's lived, and my hands had held so much: children, dreams, pain, goodbyes, joy, loss, responsibilities. There were marks on them no one else could see, but I knew everyone, and in that moment, my hands felt heavy, as if they carried not only everything I had lived, but also what he tried to make me feel. I closed my eyes for a moment, as if trying to hide inside myself, and in the darkness behind my eyelids came flashes of things I wished I could forget, moments when I had been diminished, silenced, disrespected, words that stayed, not because they were true, but because they hurt enough to leave marks. And I understood then that what he said that day wasn't just an isolated humiliation. It was the drop that overflowed a memory already too full. Self-esteem, no matter how strong it seems, sometimes behaves like crystal, sturdy when whole, but vulnerable when it has small cracks from years of pressure. And I felt one of those cracks widen, not because I believed in what he said, but because he reinforced something the world had tried to make me believe so many times. The idea that I wasn't enough. The idea that my worth could be measured by someone who never knew me. The idea that I needed to shrink, to fit into spaces much too small. And this is where a different kind of pain begins. The pain of fighting against a lie that tries to enter your soul. The pain of resisting the temptation to believe that what was said about you has any truth at all. The pain of protecting everything you've built inside yourself with so much effort. Because when you spend a lifetime piecing your self-esteem together from fragments of courage, kindness, faith, struggle, and dignity, any attack, no matter how small it seems, threatens to tear down something important that took you years to build. That night was long. I walked around the house without direction, touched objects without really seeing them, tried to distract myself, but everything pulled me back to the same point. The moment his words sliced through the air and struck me, I felt as if I were carrying a weight on my back, a weight that felt like decades compressed into a single moment. The silent kind of weight that so many women know, but few admit, because the world expects us to be strong all the time. I sat at the edge of the bed and stared at nothing, and as I did, I realized the wound wasn't just emotional, it was spiritual. It felt as if something deep inside me had been shaken, as if my faith were being tested again. I had faced big pains before, had survived betrayals, buried dreams, endured deep losses, but there was something in the way he treated me that touched a part of my essence I had always protected carefully. And in that moment, I began talking to myself, not out loud, but in my mind. A sincere, intimate, heavy conversation. I asked myself why it had hurt so much, and the answer came like a whisper, because he made me remember who I used to be. The woman who accepted everything in silence. The woman who always put others above herself. The woman who believed she needed to be perfect to deserve respect. The woman who once allowed harsh words to define her identity. And I realized that old version of me still existed somewhere, hidden deep in my soul. And that realization hurt. It hurt because it showed that healing is never truly finished. It hurt because it revealed that even after so many years, there was still a part of me vulnerable to that kind of attack. It hurt because it showed that the past, no matter how distant, always finds a way to come back when we least expect it. As those reflections filled me, I felt something move deep within. It wasn't strength. It wasn't anger. It felt more like clarity, a painful but necessary clarity. The clarity that I was standing before a choice. Allow that humiliation to shape my days, or turn that pain into something that would reveal even more of who I am. Before lying down, I felt a strange urge to speak to other women, even if only in my thoughts. A desire to say, write in the comments, I know what it feels like to carry this kind of silence, because I know so many would understand exactly what that means. Many have lived silent humiliations that hurt more than any shout. Many have felt the sensation of being erased by someone who sees themselves above everything. Many have had to gather their own pieces after a cruel sentence. And there, in that quiet bedroom, I realized this story was far from over. Because no matter how hard I tried to close my eyes and sleep, something kept me awake. Something telling me there was still a truth hidden behind that encounter. A truth I would need to face, understand, and perhaps transform. A truth that was about to change the direction of my life in a way I could never have imagined. And so, walking through old memories and new wounds, the night passed, leaving me with the sense that the next day wouldn't be like the others. Something was waiting, something I couldn't yet see, but that was calling me in silence. The next morning arrived with a kind of tiredness that doesn't come from the body, but from the soul. That deep, quiet exhaustion that appears when something inside us has been shaken in a way we don't yet understand. I woke up feeling as if the weight of the night had slept beside me, but there was also a different kind of restlessness. It wasn't just pain. It was curiosity, as if behind that humiliation there was something bigger, something I couldn't fully see yet, but that was there, asking to be uncovered. I spent a long time sitting on the edge of the bed, trying to organize my thoughts, and as the hours passed, I realized that the millionaire's memory wouldn't leave me alone, not just because of the cruelty of his words, but because of the way he looked at me before and after he spoke. There was something in his expression that I hadn't noticed at the time, something hidden behind the arrogance, something deeper than simple superiority, a shadow, a mark, an emptiness he was desperately trying to fill with power. While the coffee heated, I stood by the window, trying to push away the feeling that there was more to that story than the humiliation itself. And almost without meaning to, my mind began replaying every detail of the encounter, every gesture, every look, every pause. And the more I replayed it, the more I felt that man carried something invisible to those who admired him, worked for him, or feared him. And that's when the first sign appeared, something I didn't recognize as a sign at the time, but later understood as the beginning of a revelation that would completely change the way I saw him. Small detail, almost invisible, but for someone whose eyes have been trained by life, a detail speaks louder than any speech. I remembered him holding something between his fingers while he humiliated me, a small object he gripped tightly, as if it were the only thing keeping him upright, something that trembled slightly between his hands. At the time, I thought it was anger, but the next day, looking back with clearer eyes, I realized it wasn't anger. It was desperation. And that realization hit me with the same force the humiliation had the day before, because suddenly the image of that arrogant, firm, untouchable man began to crack in my mind. And behind that crack, something far more human began to appear. I spent the day with that thought pounding inside me, until a coincidence, which I later understood was not a coincidence, led me to discover that the millionaire was not just the powerful man people saw. He was someone marked by a story he fought desperately to hide. A story that, once it reached me, made everything take on a different meaning. I was out running errands, trying to distract my mind, when I overheard two people talking about him. It wasn't gossip, it was concern. And when I heard his name, my whole body went on alert. I slowed down without thinking, just to listen better. They were discussing something he had been dealing with for months, something only a few people knew, something he tried to hide from the world using every weapon he had: money, power, emotional distance, harshness. And for the first time, the pieces began to fit together. He wasn't just an arrogant man. He was a desperate man, a broken man, a man wounded by something no amount of money could fix. And that explained so much. The empty look, the harsh way of speaking, the constant need to appear superior, that aura of superiority that felt more like armor than pride. Truly happy people don't build armor. They don't need to. As I got closer, the voices became clearer. They didn't mention specifics, but enough to reveal that the millionaire had recently lost someone. A deep loss, a loss that had torn something essential out of him, a loss that, according to those people, had completely changed the way he treated the world. They said he hadn't been the same since, that he'd become hard, distant, impatient, cold, that he carried a constant anger against everything and everyone, but above all, an even greater anger against himself. That revelation hit me like a wave, not because it justified what he had done, because humiliation is never justified, but because it brought to the surface something I needed to see, the truth behind the monster he tried to be. The truth no one noticed because they were too busy looking at his wealth, the truth he himself was afraid to face. I returned home with my mind pounding. I felt something deep happening inside me, a mix of shock, compassion, disbelief, and the strange sense that I was being pulled into a story far larger than I had imagined. I sat in the same chair as the night before, but this time the silence felt different. It wasn't just pain. Now there was understanding. Expansion, a new kind of weight, not directed at me anymore, but at him. I began to see that man, not only for what he had done, but for what he was trying to hide: turmoil, loneliness, remorse, failures, ghosts that followed him like silent shadows. And I realized his arrogance wasn't just a trait, it was a defense mechanism, a wall, a shield, a reaction to his own emotional collapse. It's strange how truth has the power to change even the shape of pain. When I learned he carried a loss, a deep, unresolved grief, my own wound began to transform. It didn't lessen, it didn't vanish, but it transformed. Because now the humiliation he caused me didn't feel like a targeted attack. It felt like a blow he delivered to everyone who came near him, maybe out of fear of something even bigger, maybe out of fear of being seen completely. I took deep breaths as those realizations arranged themselves inside me like pieces of an emotional puzzle. And as I breathed, I remembered something I'd always heard from the older women in my family. The ones who hurt the most are the ones who hurt inside. And for the first time, that sentence made sense in a way I had never felt before. If you want to write that in the comments, write, "The ones who hurt the most are the ones who hurt inside." As I repeated that phrase in my mind, something began to shift inside me. It wasn't forgiveness, it was understanding. A huge difference, one only women who have carried a lot of pain can truly feel. I was still wounded, the humiliation still burned, but now there was a new space inside me. A space that said, wait, watch, there is more to this story, much more. And that, so much more, began revealing itself slowly, like a veil being lifted, showing fragments of a past he had tried to bury beneath every luxury he owned. Fragments of mistakes, regrets, broken ties, fragments that, when placed together, revealed that the man behind the immaculate facade was someone profoundly alone. It took me some time to absorb that, because when we're wounded, Our first reaction is to reject anything that humanizes the person who hurt us. But life has its own way of revealing truths we didn't ask for but desperately need. And in that moment, I realized that the humiliation he caused me didn't begin there, in that room where our sharp glances collided. It began long before, in places I had never seen, in pains he never shared, in stories the world never knew, stories that, without meaning to, began intertwining with mine. And as night approached again, bringing a silence that now held not only my pain, but his as well, I felt I was about to step into a part of the story no one else could see, the part where the shine of wealth doesn't reach, the part where pride can't disguise vulnerability, the part where truth, no matter how deeply buried, finally rises to the surface. And it was there, exactly there, in that moment when past and present began to weave themselves inside me, that I understood the story wasn't just about what he said to me. It was about why he said it, and that reason I was still about to discover. He never imagined that the woman he tried to diminish, the woman he thought was just another shadow in his path, carried something inside her that no amount of money could ever buy. The turning point began subtly, almost imperceptibly, the same way great shifts happen when destiny rearranges two lives that were never meant to cross. I, still carrying the invisible marks of humiliation, began noticing small movements around me, signs the universe leaves scattered when a deep truth is about to emerge, signs I often recognize late, but that now appeared brightly before me. It all started when certain people around him began looking at me differently. It wasn't superficial curiosity. It was as if they saw something in me that he, blinded by arrogance, never noticed. Maybe because those people knew the truth behind the millionaire's facade. Maybe because they slowly realized that the way he treated me said far more about him than about me. Or maybe because, even without knowing the details of my life, they sensed the strength I carried. The silent strength so many black women learn to guard as one guards a sacred temple. It was on a quiet afternoon, while I was out doing something simple, that I met one of these people. A woman who had worked near him for many years, someone who knew him well enough to understand what existed beneath his glittering surface. She approached gently, unsure if she should speak, and said my name with a softness that surprised me. There was respect in her eyes, but something else too, recognition. And when she spoke the first words, I realized she knew exactly who I was, long before the millionaire ever did. She said she knew me from stories from long ago, stories from a time when I was much younger, stories I never bothered to spread around because bragging was never my nature, stories about my journey, my work, the dedication I had poured into my community, my family, and the women who sought me out for guidance, support, and voice, stories about my intelligence, my courage, my strength in the hardest moments, my ability to teach, to comfort, to guide, to build pathways where there had once been darkness. And what struck me most was the way she described these things, as if she were speaking of someone who deserved admiration, not humiliation. As she spoke, something moved inside my chest. It wasn't pride. It was something closer to spiritual validation. The feeling that the world was finally seeing who I had always been, even when the millionaire tried to reduce me to nothing. And this woman, whom I barely knew, looked deep into my eyes and said something that made me realize the turning point had already begun. He has no idea who you are, and when he finds out, he's going to regret what he said. If you want, write in the comments, "He never imagined." Her words came like a warning, like a sign of something greater on the horizon, and deep down, I knew she was right, because men like him, accustomed to seeing only what serves their ego, never notice when they're standing before someone whose story is richer and deeper than any bank account could ever be. The story of what he had done to me began spreading quietly, not loudly, but in the silent way truth always spreads. People he had hurt before, people who had witnessed his arrogance, people who recognized the pain I was carrying, began approaching me with eyes full of solidarity and a desire for justice. And slowly, he started hearing my name whispered in places where he never expected to hear it. He noticed the murmurs, the glances, the subtle comments that appeared when he entered a room, and it disturbed him deeply, because men like him hate losing control of the narrative. He tried to ignore it at first, tried to act as if nothing had happened. But the truth is that his conscience began to stir, even if he wouldn't admit it. The humiliation he had thrown at me returned to him like a mirror, and every time he caught his reflection, he sensed something had changed. He could no longer hold up that facade of absolute superiority with the same force. The poison he cast at me began seeping back toward him, not out of revenge, but simply because truth has weight. The turning point became even clearer when he accidentally discovered part of my past. He heard my name again, but this time from someone he respected, someone who spoke of me with admiration, someone who told stories about my work, my accomplishments, my role in the lives of people he valued, someone who made it clear that I wasn't just any older woman. I was someone who had made an impact, someone who had left good marks on the world, someone who carried dignity like armor and wisdom like inheritance. When he heard that, something inside him trembled, because until then, he believed he had humiliated me without consequence, believed he had belittled someone who meant nothing. But the truth he never expected was this: I possessed something he never had. True respect. Respect that can't be bought. Respect that can't be demanded. Respect that is earned. He learned that I had helped shape lives, guided young people, cared for individuals who now held important positions. He learned that many people knew me not for how I looked, but for who I was. He learned that my name carried weight, spiritual weight, moral weight, emotional weight. And in trying to reduce me, he had made a terrible mistake, humiliating someone whose story was far greater than he had imagined. That's when he began searching for me with his eyes, not openly, but cautiously, like someone trying to piece together a broken puzzle. He wanted to understand how someone like me, someone who didn't display wealth, who didn't impose authority, who walked calmly, could carry so much strength within, the strength he lacked, the strength he tried to steal with cruel words, the strength his wealth could never buy. And I noticed the discomfort every time he saw me. I noticed the hesitation. I noticed the silent regret he tried to hide. I noticed the discomfort of someone who had set fire to his own conscience. I noticed the mix of curiosity and shame. And above all, I noticed he was discovering, too late, who I really was. The turning point wasn't one single moment. It was a process through which he slowly realized his image of power was fragile, that in the presence of my dignity, his arrogance shrank, that in the presence of my story, his coldness faltered, that in the presence of my silent strength, his emotional empire began to crumble. And that's exactly what happened. The castle he built around his own pain began collapsing when he realized I was the wrong woman to try to humiliate, that my soul wasn't as fragile as he thought, that my past carried more greatness than anything he could flaunt, that I was, and had always been, a spiritual force far greater than he could ever comprehend. And when that shift began, he understood something that struck him harder than the truth about me. He had been completely mistaken about who he was dealing with. If you want to write it in the comments, write, "He misjudged me." And that's how emotional justice began, to align itself, preparing the path for something even greater. Because from that moment on, every step he took, every glance, every gesture, began revealing that behind the humiliation he inflicted, there was another truth waiting to surface, a truth that would change the entire story. When I realized the turning point was already unfolding, something inside me grew quiet, not the kind of peace that comes after a victory because I hadn't won anything yet. It was the calm that comes before a revelation, the sense that life was guiding me toward an inevitable ending, one I didn't seek, but one that had been prepared for me. After everything that happened, after carrying the weight of that humiliation for days, I knew I couldn't simply move on without looking directly into the eyes of what had wounded me. And in that moment, more than ever, I felt that this encounter was about to happen. Life has a curious way of placing us face to face with what we need to confront, even when we try to avoid it. And that's how, without warning, without planning, without control, I found myself standing before him once again, the millionaire, the man who had hurt me with words I still haven't revealed, the man who thought he could walk through my dignity the way someone walks through a fragile door, the man who now carried in his eyes a weight that hadn't been there before, A weight I recognized immediately because it wasn't arrogance, it was awareness. He saw me before I saw him. And when our eyes finally met, I realized something in him had changed. It wasn't guilt, at least not at first. It was restlessness, as if he were standing in front of a mirror that was finally reflecting what he had always avoided seeing. A mirror showing his own moral poverty, his own fragility, his own hidden pain. And in that moment, I knew he had learned everything he needed to know about me. Not because someone sat him down and explained, but because the truths that belong to women like me always find a way to reveal themselves without effort, without noise, without spectacle, just by the power of our existence. He took a few steps toward me, but this time in a completely different way than before. There was no rush, no superiority, none of that energy of someone who believes they own the room. It was a hesitant step, a step that exposed his fear of himself, fear of me, fear of what he was about to hear, the kind of fear that only appears when a man is forced to face his own failures without armor, without shields, without excuses. I stood still, not out of pride, but out of understanding. Understanding that this moment didn't need shouting, arguments, or a scene. It needed truth, and above all, it needed dignity. Mine, the dignity he tried to rip away with poor words, the dignity that remained intact despite everything, the dignity I carried not like a trophy, but like a deep root running through my soul. When he finally stopped in front of me, the silence between us was so intense it felt alive. A heavy silence, full of things unsaid, a silence carrying regret, doubt, fear, memories, and above all, a question he didn't have the courage to ask. I could see in his eyes the confusion of someone who doesn't know where to begin, and for a few seconds, I thought he would look away, like so many do when they realize they're no longer in control. But he didn't. He held my gaze, as if searching in me for an answer he had never managed to find inside himself. He opened his mouth, like a man reaching for words in a place he had never been before. Sincerity. But nothing came out. Absolutely nothing. And that alone already said a lot. Because when a man who's used to speaking, commanding, ordering, humiliating, suddenly loses his words in front of the woman he tried to destroy, that's a sign his conscience has finally caught up to him. I stayed silent, waiting, not because I wanted to hear an apology, especially because easy apologies mean nothing when they come from people who never learned how to truly ask for forgiveness. I wanted to hear the truth he was carrying inside him, the truth that was about to spill out like a weight his body could no longer hold. And he tried. He really tried. But when he finally managed to force out the first sentence, it came out twisted, broken, as if struggling to push through decades of hardened pride. He said my name, the same name he had once used to hurt me, now wrapped in a softness that sounded almost strange in that previously harsh voice. And in that instant, I realized he was trying to rebuild a bridge he had burned with his own hands. But before he could continue, I lifted my hand and asked for silence. Not an aggressive silence, a necessary one. A silence that carried everything I needed to say. I took a deep breath. The air still felt heavy, but it no longer hurt the way it once did. And that's when I told him what needed to be said. I didn't have to raise my voice. I didn't have to accuse him. I didn't have to attack him back. I spoke with the calm of someone whose strength cannot be pierced by cruelty. The calm of someone who no longer needs to prove anything to anyone. The calm of someone who knows exactly what she's worth. I told him that the words that wound us are not forgotten, but they also do not define us. I told him that humiliation only finds shelter in empty souls, and mine has never been empty. I told him that true wealth has no price tag, because it can't be measured in dollars, in assets, or in status. It's measured in character, in truth, in humanity. If you want to write it in the comments, write, "True wealth has no price." He stood there, completely undone. Not because I attacked him, but because I showed him what he had tried to hide his whole life, that in front of a whole woman, a broken man has no power at all, that in front of dignity, arrogance crumbles, that in front of truth, pride kneels. And for the first time, I saw something in his eyes I never expected to see. Shame. Not the shallow kind, the deep kind, the kind that belongs to someone who realizes they hurt a person who didn't deserve it, the shame of someone finally understanding that their sense of superiority was nothing but illusion. I watched him take a deep breath, like a man who had just taken a hit no one else could see. And in a way, he had, because my words didn't come from anger. They came from my soul. And when words born from the soul are spoken, they find their way straight to whatever needs to fall. He tried to speak again, but this time there was no arrogance in his tone, only a desperate attempt to cling to some part of that conversation that might save him from himself. But I didn't need to hear anything else. I already knew enough. I had already seen enough. The shift was complete. He had discovered who I was, too late. And more than that, he had discovered that nothing he owned could buy back the most valuable thing he lost that day, his own conscience. And it was exactly in that suspended moment, somewhere between past and future, that something even deeper began to rise. A force I didn't fully understand yet. A silent force inside me. A force that told me this story wasn't over. That something even more important was still coming. Something that wasn't about revenge, or payback, or punishment. It was about revelation. And that revelation was only a few steps away. As he stood there absorbing the impact of my words, I felt something shift inside me in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't victory over him. It was something far more intimate, deeper, older. It was as if, for the first time in a long while, a forgotten part of my soul was waking up again. That final encounter, painful as it was, opened up a space inside me I didn't know still existed. A space where truth could fit without hurting. Where dignity could breathe without fear, where my essence could finally return to the place. Humiliation tried to steal from it. He kept looking at me, still reaching for words that didn't exist, while I stood firm yet at peace. And in that moment, I realized that the weight I had been carrying since the day he humiliated me no longer belonged to me. It was dissolving, thinning out, fading away like a shadow that finally lost its strength after being exposed to enough light. And that light was coming from inside me, not from anything he said or did, but from something I had finally seen. Clearly, I was no longer the woman he tried to break. I had changed along the way. When he finally lowered his eyes to the floor, as if facing his own inner abyss for the first time, I felt a strange kind of sadness. Not for me, for him, because there is no greater misery than that of a man trapped inside his own arrogance. No deeper poverty than that of someone who never learned how to truly love. No loneliness greater than that of a person who tries to buy respect and ends up buying only silence. I didn't look at him with hatred. I looked with clarity. And clarity is something I refuse to let go of once life offers it to me. I left him there, standing with his newborn conscience weighing heavy on his shoulders, and I walked away without looking back. The air felt different, lighter, cleaner. As if I had walked through a door and left an old burden on the other side. I walked slowly, feeling the ground beneath my feet, feeling my body rearranging itself from the inside. Humiliation still existed in my memory, but it no longer hurt in the same way. It was like a scar that no longer aches, but reminds you of where you've been, what you've faced, what you've overcome. When I got home, I closed the door and felt the silence welcoming me. But this time, it was a different kind of silence, not the same silence that had crushed me on previous nights. This silence embraced me. It said, "Now you are whole. Now you can breathe. Now you can let go." And for the first time, since that day, I allowed myself to take a deep breath without feeling pain. The air came into my chest like a fresh breeze, filling spaces that had long been crowded with hurt. I sat in the same place where so many times I had felt small, and I realized there was nothing in that space that could diminish me anymore. The house felt bigger, not because anything in it had changed, but because my spirit had expanded. The humiliation that once pressed me down now seemed distant, almost unrecognizable, as if it no longer had the power to touch my essence. I began to think about everything I had lived through up to that point, everything I had survived, every time I had to find strength where there was none, every woman in my lineage, the ones who came before me and carried burdens far heavier than mine, women who taught me, even without words, that dignity isn't something you beg for, it's something you claim. Strong women, Wise women, quiet women, women who taught me that when a woman truly knows herself, no one can completely break her. And there, sitting in my own living room, I felt those women with me. I felt my ancestors breathing with me, walking beside me, reminding me of who I was long before that man crossed my path. I felt their arms around me. I felt the protection that has always followed me, even in my hardest moments. I felt that invisible strength that exists only in the soul of a woman who knows her story is bigger than any wound. I ran my hand gently over my own skin and felt a tenderness I hadn't felt in a long time. I had forgotten to take care of myself, to look at myself with kindness, to remember that even strong women need healing. And in that instant, I realized that healing was coming, not as something quick or instant, but as a quiet, deep, spiritual process. A process that was giving me back pieces of myself I didn't even know I had lost. The faith that had felt dormant over the last few days began to pulse again, slowly but strong. I had always known that God never abandoned me, even in moments when I myself struggled to feel His presence. And in that moment, I felt Him there, guiding every breath, every thought, every memory. He was showing me that the humiliation was never meant to destroy me, but to reveal the strength that still lived inside me, a strength that needed to be remembered, a strength that needed to be honored. I closed my eyes and felt a peace that didn't come from the outside, but from within, a peace that whispered, "You deserve to be treated with love." Write that in the comments if you'd like. I deserve to be treated with love. That phrase, simple and powerful, was the key to my liberation, because for years, maybe even decades, I put the pain of others above my own. I offered understanding where there was no reciprocity. I offered care where there was no acknowledgement. I offered love where nothing came back. And in that moment, I finally understood that the love I had always longed to receive had to begin with me. I stood up slowly and walked through my home, touching objects that told the story of my life. Old photographs, family memories, small treasures that carried reminders of difficult seasons and joyful ones, pieces that formed the foundation of the woman I had become. And with each one I touched, I felt myself reclaiming pieces of my strength. It wasn't the same strength as before. It was a renewed strength, purified, filtered through pain, but enriched by understanding. I realized that liberation doesn't happen all at once. It comes in layers. Layers that peel away slowly, like old skins that have already served their purpose. And in that moment, one of those layers finally fell away. The layer of humiliation. The layer of weight that was never mine. The layer of pain that didn't match my essence. The layer of lies someone tried to place over me, but that never belonged to my truth. And suddenly, everything made sense. The humiliation I felt, the final encounter, the revelation about his past, the shift that placed my story in front of him like a mirror. All of it was part of something greater, something I only understood once I allowed the pain to leave. Life had shown me that my dignity was unshakable, that my soul was bigger than any cruel word, that my story was stronger than any attempt to diminish me. I sat down again, but this time with a different posture. Not the posture of someone wounded, not the posture of someone waiting for understanding. It was the posture of a woman liberated, a woman whole, a woman who knows that what hurt her does not define who she is, the posture of a woman who has finally let go of a burden she carried alone. And I felt every part of my life slowly fall back into place. And it was in that exact moment that I sensed the story still held one last truth, a truth not about him, but about me, a truth approaching slowly, like a sunrise that lights up the horizon before it touches the earth, a truth I was finally ready to hear. When I finally looked inside myself and recognized that the weight no longer belonged to me, it felt like life had led me to the center of a truth that had always been there, patiently waiting for me to be ready. The humiliation I tried to hide, the pain I tried to silence, the shadow I tried to carry alone, all of it turned into a lesson that now rested before me with a clarity deeper than anything money could buy. Because in the end, what he said revealed far more about him than about me. The poor words he chose were not random. They came from a heart so empty it no longer knew how to recognize humanity. When a man has everything yet has no peace, he tries to fill his own emptiness by wounding the world around him. And that's what he did. He spoke like someone who had lost his way. He hurt the way people hurt when they've never learned how to heal themselves. He humiliated like someone who fears facing his own truth. I learned through this process that there is a massive difference between material wealth and spiritual wealth, a difference that doesn't show in the eyes of those who flaunt, but in the eyes of those who feel. Money buys tall ceilings, but it cannot lift the soul. It buys shine, but it cannot illuminate the conscience. It buys fake respect, but it cannot build character. And that was exactly what became clear to me. He had too much money to fit inside himself, but not enough dignity to fit in the world. True wealth is never in the hands. It's in the heart. It's in the choices we make. It's in how we treat others when no one is watching. It's in what we offer the world even when the world offers nothing in return. And above all, it's in that quiet strength every woman carries within herself. The strength to rebuild, to rise again, to know herself, and to honor herself. And that strength, I discovered, cannot be bought, cannot be bargained, cannot be negotiated. It is born from each of our stories. It is born from the battles we fight in silence, born from the scars we hide with dignity, born from the choices we make with courage when no one believes in us, born from the faith that sustains us when the world tries to break us. And that's why I say, with every certainty in my soul, no poor word has the power to diminish a woman who is rich in spirit. His poverty wasn't in his pockets, it was in his chest, and no matter how much he tried to hide it, life found a way to expose it. My wealth, on the other hand, never needed to be shown. It had always lived within me, in my path, in my past, in my ancestry, in the dignity he tried to touch but could never break. And after walking this journey, I understood that everything has a purpose, even pain, even humiliation, even encounters that look like coincidences but carry deep lessons. Life showed me that while some people collect gold, I collect truths. While some accumulate possessions, I accumulate stories. While some seek power, I seek peace. And in the end, that is what truly matters. So I leave you with a reflection I've carried for years. Wise is the woman who understands that it is not gold that shines, it is the soul. That is what lights the path. That is what sustains us. That is what transforms us. And that is why, even after everything I heard, I remain whole. I remain strong. I remain rich, but rich with the one kind of wealth no one can take from me. And now, breathing in this new quiet that has awakened inside me, I leave you with this truth. You deserve to be treated with love, with respect, with dignity. Write it in the comments if you'd like. My soul has worth, because it does. It always did. It always will. Nothing anyone says can dim the light that shines in you. And before we close, I need to tell you something important. Right there on your screen is another video. It isn't a continuation of this story, but it carries another deep truth from the matriarch's secrets, another powerful reflection, another message born to reach the heart of whoever needs it. Allow yourself to continue this spiritual, emotional, and ancestral journey. Tap on the next video and come with me, because there is always more wisdom waiting for you.